$5,000. That's how much my homeowners association demanded I pay, because I was growing tomatoes. Not because my yard was messy. Not because I broke the law. Not because I endangered anyone. According to the HOA president, my small vegetable garden was damaging the prestige of the neighborhood. They gave me 7 days to destroy everything I had spent 2 years building. When I refused, they doubled down. They sent inspectors to my property. They threatened legal action. They even told my neighbors I was lowering everyone's property values. What happened next was something they never saw coming. Because 6 months later, the very judge hearing the case laughed out loud in the courtroom. And by the time the hearing ended, the HOA wasn't asking me for money anymore. They were desperately trying to explain themselves. If you've ever dealt with an HOA that thought it could control every inch of your property, stay with me. Because this story proves that sometimes the smallest garden can grow the biggest lesson. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 63 years old, retired after nearly 4 decades as a high school science teacher, and I live in a quiet suburb just outside Denver. My wife, Linda, and I bought our home 12 years ago. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't the nicest house on the block. But it was ours. We spent years turning the backyard into our little escape. A wooden bench under a maple tree. A stone pathway. A tiny fish pond. And one day, after retirement, I decided to build 4 raised garden beds. Nothing fancy. Just cedar boxes about waist high. Inside them I planted tomatoes, cucumbers, lettuce, peppers, carrots, green beans, and a few herbs. Every morning started the same way. Coffee in one hand. Garden hose in the other. Watching the sun rise while watering vegetables became more relaxing than any vacation I'd ever taken. The garden wasn't just about saving money. It reminded me of growing up on my grandfather's farm in Kansas. Back then, every meal started in the garden before it reached the kitchen table. Working with soil brought those memories back. Soon, my neighbors started stopping by. Mrs. Jenkins loved my cherry tomatoes. The family across the street asked for gardening tips. Kids walking home from school would point excitedly at the giant pumpkins I experimented with every fall. It became something the whole neighborhood enjoyed. Or at least, that's what I thought. Everything changed one Tuesday afternoon. I had just finished pulling weeds when a white SUV stopped in front of my house. The driver's door opened. Out stepped a woman wearing expensive sunglasses, carrying a leather folder against her chest like it contained classified government secrets that I'd seen her before. Patricia Holloway. The newly elected HOA president. She walked across my lawn without introducing herself. No smile. No greeting. Just a quick glance toward the garden. Then she frowned. Mr. Carter. Yes. I'm here regarding multiple violations. I looked around, genuinely confused. Violations? She opened the folder. We've received complaints concerning your agricultural installation. I blinked. My what? She pointed dramatically toward the raised beds. That. For a second, I honestly thought she was joking. A vegetable garden? She nodded with complete seriousness. Your property currently resembles a commercial farming operation. I laughed. Actually laughed. Because there were exactly 4 raised beds. Together they occupied less space than most people's backyard patios. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. She handed me an envelope. Inside was an official HOA notice. My smile disappeared. The document listed 3 violations. Unauthorized agricultural use. Visual inconsistency with community standards. Negative impact on neighborhood aesthetics. At the bottom was the demand that made my stomach drop. Remove the garden within 7 days. Or face an immediate fine of $5,000, plus additional daily penalties. I looked back at Patricia. You're fining me for growing vegetables? Without changing her expression, she replied. The rules are the rules. Then she turned around, walked back to her SUV, and drove away as if she'd just saved the neighborhood from some terrible disaster. I stood there holding the notice while the wind rustled through the tomato plants. For the first time since moving into that neighborhood, my peaceful little garden didn't feel peaceful anymore. I stood in my backyard for several minutes, staring at the violation notice. $5,000. For growing tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, and lettuce. It sounded so ridiculous that I actually wondered if someone had made a mistake. That evening, Linda sat across from me at the kitchen table reading every page of the notice. She adjusted her glasses and frowned. Daniel, have you ever seen anything like this? I shook my head. In 12 years? Never. She flipped to the last page. They're giving us 7 days. I nodded silently. Linda looked toward the backyard through the kitchen window. They're beautiful. The setting sun reflected off the tomato plants, making them glow bright red. I know, I said quietly. And I'm not tearing them out. The next morning, I decided to visit the HOA office. I wasn't looking for a fight. I simply wanted an explanation. The office was only a 10-minute drive away, located beside the community clubhouse. When I walked inside, Patricia Holloway was already there, speaking with the property manager. She looked up and gave me a polite, but clearly rehearsed, smile. Mr. Carter. I'd like to discuss this notice. She folded her hands. The violation has already been reviewed. I just want to know one thing. She raised an eyebrow. What exactly is wrong with my garden? Without hesitation, she replied, it doesn't match the image our community is trying to present. I stared at her. It's vegetables. It's agriculture. It's 4 wooden boxes. It's a violation. I leaned slightly forward. Can you show me the rule? She pulled a thick binder off the shelf. For nearly 2 minutes she flipped through page after page. Finally, she stopped. There. I read the paragraph. It prohibited commercial farming, livestock, large-scale agricultural businesses. I looked back at Patricia. My backyard isn't a farm. She didn't answer. Instead, she closed the binder. The board has interpreted the rule. That sentence told me everything. There wasn't a clear rule against my garden. They were simply deciding there should be one. As I walked back to my truck, someone called my name. Daniel. It was my neighbor, Mike Thompson. Mike had lived across the street for nearly 15 years. He lowered his voice. Did Patricia really fine you over your garden? I held up the notice. He read the amount. His eyes widened that I nodded. Mike laughed in disbelief. My wife buys tomatoes from you every summer. Apparently that's a threat to property values. He shook his head. This is getting out of hand. Then he leaned closer. You know you're not the first. What do you mean? I nodded. Mike laughed in disbelief. My wife buys tomatoes from you every summer. Apparently that's a threat to property values. He shook his head. This is getting out of hand. Then he leaned closer. You know you're not the first. What do you mean? Mike glanced around to make sure nobody else was listening. Last year she forced the Wilson family to remove their children's treehouse. I frowned. I remember. The year before that? He continued. She fined an elderly couple because their mailbox was painted the wrong shade of black. I sighed. So this isn't about my vegetables. Mike shook his head. No. It's about control. Over the next few days, something unexpected happened. Neighbors began stopping by. Not to criticize my garden. To support it. Mrs. Jenkins arrived carrying homemade blueberry muffins. I heard what happened. She looked at the tomatoes. My grandchildren love these. I know. You keep fighting. The Ramirez family brought fresh lemonade. A young couple offered to write letters supporting us. Even children walking home from school asked, "Are they really making you get rid of the pumpkins?" I smiled. I hope not. The entire neighborhood seemed confused. Except for one person. Patricia. Every afternoon, her white SUV slowly drove past our house. Sometimes she'd stop. Take pictures. Write notes. Then drive away. It felt less like an HOA inspection. And more like surveillance. One evening, Linda stood beside the kitchen window watching the SUV disappear down the street. She crossed her arms. Daniel. I know. Something doesn't feel right. I looked toward the garden. Neither of us realized. The $5,000 fine was only the beginning. 3 days later, another envelope arrived. This one was thicker. And far more intimidating. Across the front, in bold red letters, it read, "Final notice before legal action." Linda looked at me with concern. Already? I slowly opened it. Inside was a formal letter from the HOA's attorney. According to the document, because I had refused to correct the violation, the board had approved additional penalties. The original $5,000 fine would remain. But starting the following Monday, they would charge me $100 every single day until the garden was removed. If I continued to refuse, they warned they could place a lien on my home. I read that sentence twice. Then a third time. All because of 4 raised garden beds. Linda placed her hand on my shoulder. They're trying to scare us. They are. For the first time since this started, I felt a knot in my stomach. The next afternoon, I decided to review every HOA document we had received when we bought the house. Boxes of paperwork had been sitting untouched in the basement for years. I spread everything across the dining room table. By evening, I had read hundreds of pages. Rules about roof colors, mailbox styles, fence heights, holiday decorations, parking regulations. But one thing kept standing out: there was no rule that specifically banned residential vegetable gardens. In fact, one older document actually encouraged homeowners to maintain healthy landscaping that enhances the neighborhood. I looked at Linda. "Do you remember this?" She nodded. They even gave us gardening tips when we moved in. So how is this suddenly illegal? Neither of us had an answer. The following morning, my phone rang. It was Mike. "Daniel, you've got to see this." "What happened?" "I'll be there in 5 minutes." When he arrived, he was carrying his phone. "You know Patricia keeps driving past your house. Every day. I think I know why." He opened a neighbor. Someone had posted aerial images of our subdivision. There were comments underneath. One caught my attention immediately. "The board needs to eliminate backyard gardens before new buyers start touring the neighborhood." Another read, "Vegetable beds make the community look too rural." Then I saw who had written them. Patricia Holloway. Not only that. She had replied to another comment saying, "Once one homeowner removes theirs, the others will follow." I looked at Mike. "So this isn't about rules?" He shook his head. "No. She wants to set an example." That evening, something happened that changed everything. A black pickup truck stopped in front of our house. A man stepped out wearing work boots and a baseball cap. He introduced himself. "My name's Robert Ellis." He pointed toward the garden. "I used to serve on the HOA board." That got my attention immediately. I resigned last year. Why? He smiled bitterly. Because Patricia took over. We sat on the back patio while he told me story after story. Board meetings where members were pressured to approve unnecessary fines. Residents targeted over harmless issues. Rules being interpreted differently depending on who Patricia liked, or disliked. Then he said something that made me sit up straighter. I kept copies. Copies of what? Meeting minutes. He reached into a folder. There was never a vote banning vegetable gardens. I stared at him. The board discussed it. But several members voted against it. So the rule never passed. Robert slowly shook his head. No. She enforced it anyway. I looked down at the meeting minutes. Every page was dated. Signed. Official. One sentence was highlighted. Motion to prohibit residential vegetable gardens, failed. I couldn't believe it. For weeks, Patricia had acted as though the rule already existed. She had threatened us, sent lawyers after us. All without the board ever approving the restriction. Linda looked at me and smiled for the first time in days. So. I smiled back. She's been bluffing. I carefully placed the documents back into the folder Because at that moment, I realized something important. This wasn't just about defending my garden anymore. This was about exposing the truth. And soon, Patricia Holloway would have to explain her actions in front of a judge. That night, I barely slept. The folder Robert had given me sat on the kitchen table. Every time I walked past it, I reminded myself it was real. Official meeting minutes. Official signatures. Official proof. For weeks, Patricia had spoken with complete confidence, as if the HOA's rules were unquestionable. Now I knew something she didn't. The rule she kept enforcing had never legally existed. The next morning, I called an attorney recommended by one of my former coworkers. His name was Mark Reynolds, a local lawyer who specialized in homeowner association disputes. When I finished explaining everything, he remained quiet for a few seconds. Then he asked one question. Do you still have every letter they sent you? Every single one. Good. And the meeting minutes? I have those too. His voice became noticeably more interested. Mr. Carter. I think you have a stronger case than you realize. 2 days later, Linda and I met Mark at his office. He carefully spread all the documents across a large conference table. Violation notices. Fine statements. Photos Patricia had taken of our backyard. Emails. Board meeting records, the failed vote. Mark organized everything into neat stacks. Then he leaned back in his chair. This case isn't really about vegetables. It isn't. It's about whether an HOA can invent rules after failing to pass them. Linda looked relieved. So we're not crazy. Mark smiled. Not even close. The following week, the HOA officially filed its lawsuit. Their claim was simple. They argued that my garden violated community standards. They asked the court to uphold the $5,000 fine. They also wanted the judge to authorize additional penalties until the garden was removed. When Mark finished reading their complaint, he smiled. I was surprised. Why are you smiling? Because they just made a mistake. What mistake? They never mentioned the failed board vote. He tapped the paperwork. They're pretending the rule already existed. I understood immediately. So if we prove it didn't, they'll have a serious problem. News of the lawsuit spread through the neighborhood faster than either of us expected. People started stopping us at the grocery store. At the hardware store. Even at church. One afternoon, Mrs. Jenkins walked up carrying a basket of homemade cookies. I heard you're going to court. We are. She smiled. Good. Then she quietly handed me an envelope. Inside were 12 signed letters. Every one from a different homeowner. Each one stated the same thing. The vegetable garden had never bothered them. In fact, several families wrote that it made the neighborhood feel more welcoming. By the end of the week, we had over 30 letters of support. Mark placed them into another folder. This shows something important. What's that? The HOA claims they're protecting the neighborhood. He held up the letters. But the neighborhood doesn't agree. 3 days before the hearing, something unexpected happened. A certified letter arrived from the HOA's attorney. Mark opened it while Linda and I waited. He read silently. Then he chuckled. What? They're offering a settlement. I looked surprised. What kind of settlement? They'll reduce the fine. To what? $500. Linda frowned. They still want us to admit we violated the rules. Mark nodded. Exactly. He looked directly at me. They're hoping you'll pay a little now so this never reaches a courtroom. I didn't even have to think about it. No. Mark smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. He folded the settlement offer and placed it back into the envelope. Because once this case goes before a judge. He glanced at the folder containing the failed board vote. They're going to have a very difficult day. I looked out the office window. For weeks, Patricia had acted like she had all the power. But in just a few days, she would have to explain her actions under oath. And unlike HOA meetings, a courtroom didn't run on intimidation. It ran on evidence. The morning of the hearing arrived faster than I expected. Linda and I left the house before sunrise. Neither of us said much during the drive. The courthouse sat in the middle of downtown, its gray stone walls glowing in the early morning light. As we walked through security, I felt my heart pounding. This wasn't just about a garden anymore. It was about our home. Our reputation. And whether someone in a position of authority could simply invent rules because they didn't like something. Outside the courtroom, Mark was already waiting. He greeted us with a calm smile. Ready? I nodded. As ready as I'll ever be. He adjusted his tie and handed me a copy of the meeting minutes. Remember, he said quietly, don't react to anything Patricia says. Let the documents do the talking. I took a deep breath. I understand. A few minutes later, Patricia arrived with the HOA's attorney. She walked past us without making eye contact. She still carried herself with the same confidence I'd seen the day she handed me that first violation notice. It was obvious she believed this case would be routine. She had no idea what evidence we were about to present. The courtroom was quiet as everyone took their seats. The judge entered. Everyone stood. After the formal introductions, the HOA's attorney began presenting their case. He argued that my vegetable garden violated community standards. He claimed the board had full authority to issue fines. He insisted the penalties were necessary to protect neighborhood property values. Then he displayed photographs of my backyard on a large screen. Rows of tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, green beans. He paused dramatically. As Your Honor can see, this resembles agricultural use rather than residential landscaping. I glanced toward the judge. He leaned forward. Studied the photographs for several seconds, then he asked. Counselor. Yes, Your Honor. Where exactly is the problem? The attorney hesitated. The garden itself. The judge looked back at the photographs. I see raised flower beds with vegetables. A few people in the gallery quietly smiled when it was Patricia's turn to testify. She walked confidently to the witness stand. She explained that the board had determined vegetable gardens were inconsistent with community standards. She insisted homeowners had been informed of the policy. She even claimed the rule had existed for years. Mark didn't interrupt. He simply took notes. When Patricia finished, the judge turned toward him. Cross-examination. Mark stood. Yes, Your Honor. He approached the witness stand with a folder in his hand. Mrs. Holloway, are you familiar with the official board meeting held on March 18 of last year? Yes. Did the board discuss residential vegetable gardens during that meeting? It did. And was a vote taken? She paused. Yes. Did the motion pass? Another pause. A much longer one this time. I don't remember. Mark smiled politely. I do. He handed a document to the court clerk. Your Honor, I'd like to submit Exhibit B. The judge adjusted his glasses. He slowly read the document. The courtroom became completely silent. Page after page. His eyes moved carefully across every line. Then he reached the highlighted section. He stopped. Read it again. And finally looked up. Mrs. Holloway. His voice was calm. According to these official meeting minutes. He held up the document. The motion to ban residential vegetable gardens failed. Patricia's face turned pale. The HOA's attorney quickly leaned over and whispered something to her. She didn't respond. The judge continued reading. Then he looked at Patricia one more time. So help me understand. If the board rejected this rule, on what authority did you issue a $5,000 fine? Patricia opened her mouth. But no words came out. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. And then. The judge looked back down at the paperwork, shook his head in disbelief. And let out a short laugh. Not because the case was funny. But because the HOA's position had become impossible to defend. The room fell silent again. Everyone knew the hearing had just taken a dramatic turn. The courtroom was so quiet that I could hear the soft rustle of papers as the judge set the meeting minutes back on his desk. He looked directly at Patricia Holloway. Mrs. Holloway, he said, these are official board records. Yes, Your Honor. They clearly state that the proposed restriction on residential vegetable gardens failed to pass. Patricia lowered her eyes. Yes. The judge folded his hands. So the board never adopted such a rule. She hesitated. That's correct. The admission echoed through the courtroom. For weeks, she had insisted my garden violated HOA regulations. Now, under oath, she had just admitted the exact opposite. The judge turned toward the HOA's attorney. Counsel, would you care to explain why your client demanded a $5,000 fine based on a rule that does not exist? The attorney stood slowly. Your Honor, the board believed it had discretionary authority. The judge interrupted. Discretion does not permit inventing regulations. He paused. Especially when homeowners are threatened with liens against their property. The attorney had no response. The judge looked toward me. Mr. Carter. Yes, Your Honor. I've reviewed the photographs submitted by both parties. He smiled slightly. I see a neat, well-maintained backyard with professionally constructed raised garden beds. He glanced at another photo. I also see tomatoes that look healthier than the ones in my own garden. The courtroom erupted in gentle laughter. Even the court reporter smiled. For the first time in months. I laughed too. Then the judge's expression became serious. The court finds that the HOA acted beyond its authority. The $5,000 fine is hereby dismissed. A wave of relief washed over me. But the judge wasn't finished. The daily penalties are declared invalid. The proposed lien against Mr. Carter's property is permanently prohibited. He looked directly at Patricia. The court further orders the HOA to reimburse the defendant for reasonable legal expenses. Gasps filled the courtroom. Patricia's attorney closed his eyes. The judge delivered one final statement. Homeowners associations exist to enforce adopted rules, not personal preferences. This court will not allow governing authority to be replaced by personal opinion. With one strike of the gavel. The case was over. Outside the courthouse, Mark shook my hand. Congratulations. I smiled. I couldn't have done it without you. He laughed. You won because you kept every document. Linda wrapped her arms around me. I told you not to tear out those tomatoes. I grinned. You were right. News spread through the neighborhood before we even arrived home. Neighbors were waiting outside. Someone had made a homemade banner. Welcome home, Daniel. Mrs. Jenkins walked over carrying a basket. I brought fresh bread. The Ramirez family brought lemonade. Children ran straight to the garden. Can we still see the pumpkins this fall? I smiled. You absolutely can. Within 2 months, several board members resigned. A special election was held. Residents voted for a new HOA board that promised transparency, fairness, and clear communication. One of their first official actions was simple. They adopted a written policy confirming that residential vegetable gardens were welcome, as long as they were clean and well maintained. No more confusion. No more invented rules. No more intimidation. Today, every spring, my backyard is filled with tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, lettuce, and herbs. Neighbors stop by with baskets instead of complaints. Children still ask questions about gardening. Sometimes new residents hear the story and ask, is it true someone once tried to fine you $5,000 for growing vegetables? I smile. Yes. And what happened? I look across the garden that almost disappeared. Then I answer with the same words every time. They underestimated 2 things. A gardener's patience. And the power of the truth. If you enjoyed this story and believe common sense should always come before unnecessary rules, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever dealt with an unreasonable HOA or an entitled neighbor? I'd love to read your story below. And remember, sometimes the smallest garden can grow the biggest victory.